It is my pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the FeBo team, that is Claudio Biagetti, Sebastian Scharf, and me, as well as our PhD students, Costantino Ferrarese, Rebecca Massinelli, Alice Rieti, and Andrea Bianchini, to welcome you to our 18th webinar, the talks organized as part of our Year C project, FeBo project. The FeBinars are our think tank, and our aim is to investigate. The aim of the project is to investigate the dynamics affecting the internal and external borders and border areas of the Greek federal states. Our focus is on a big question. How can border wars be avoided? And how can federalization processes contribute to these? As a consequence, we need to work on hot topics in the current debate, such as the capacity of Koinon to implement border management policies, but also border management cultures, bottom-up, and the linearity or porosity of borders, the relevance of cross-border activities, especially with reference to the external borders of Koinon, and balance of power, especially with reference to intra-federal borders, and borders and expansion. What happens when intra-federal borders become extra-federal ones? The literature on these topics is enormous, but still in a state of flux. And for this reason, we have invited and will be inviting experts on these topics. As our FeBo friends who have been following us for 2 years now already know, FeBo organizes 2 distinct series of lectures, each with another focus, one on internal borders, and the title of this series is The Management of Internal Borders by the Federal States, and the other on external borders. The title of the series is Crossing Federal Borders, Ancient and Modern. Notwithstanding that the difference between intra-federal and interfederal border is not always clear, and further, it varies over time, still we think that intrafederal and external borders must necessarily be approached from different perspectives and with different questions. But both series have been initiated by the inaugural lecture of the project, which was delivered by Hans Beck on March the 7th of 2022, so 3 years now, involving on a case study involving both intrafederal and extrafederal borders, the Masi Plain in Boeotia, between Boeotia and Attica. Past speakers include Cinzia Berzot, Corinne Bonnet, Kaya Harter, Sibelle Breton, Francesco Palermo, an expert of contemporary federalism, collaborating with us, Professor Peter Funke, who is connected, Alex Macaulay, Hans-Joachim Gerke, Liv Donelan, Chiara Lasagni, Jeremy McInerney, Adolfo Dominguez Monedero, Petrochilos, Federica Pezzoli, and Clémence Weber-Palais, and Claudia Ottonetti, as well as an expert in anthropology and in anthropology of borders, Francesco Remotti. In the framework of our Year C project, this webinar is the 9th one of the FeBinar series Crossing Federal Borders, Ancient and Modern, and will address the management of the eastern frontier of the Aitolian Koinon in relation to neighboring communities, so external borders, expanding external borders. Our guest today is Professor Joseph Scholten, a specialist in Aitolians. He's the author of a famous book, The Politics of Plunder, the Aitolians and their Koinon in the early Hellenistic era, published by the University of California Press in 2000. It is precisely in that period, in the 3rd century BC, that Aitolian expanded to incorporate many of the neighboring lands and people and Koinon lying in central Greece. And this new political configuration contributed to the development of advanced system of federal proportional representation. Despite these institutional advances, the Aitolians are often despised in the ancient historical tradition, which views them as backward, semi-barbarous brigands. Let me quote from the review by Peter Green of this book. The Aitolians of the 3rd century BC were the boogeymen and whipping boys for every Greek state from Athens to Achaia that considered itself more civilized. Polybius in particular couldn't stand them. Primitive, treacherous, murderous, piratical, the pits pile up like snow on Helicon. End of quote. In spite of this, their ability to expand and adapt to the rapidly changing historical circumstances made them absolute protagonists among the Greeks in the Hellenistic age. And expanding implies shifting borders, at least ideally, which is the topic of our FeBo project. I'm sure Scholten will tell us a lot about this today. Some of the exciting aspects are the relations between the Aitolians and the Delphic Amphiktyones and the ways in which the Aitolians incorporate other Koinon of central Greece, as the Phocians, the Locrians, both the western and the eastern, east to the so-called Phocian corridor with Daphnis. So it's really the time now to give the floor to Joseph Scholten for his FeBinar, bearing the title Aitolians and Amphiktyones, Koinon sans frontières. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, thank you, Elena, so much for that lovely introduction. I was quite surprised, in fact, to learn that somehow this book I wrote a long time ago. I'm very pleased to see Peter Funke here, by the way, amongst those who are in our illustrious gathering. Hello, Peter. It's been a long time since we've seen each other. I see Elizabeth Meyer is also on here, zooming in from closer climes from you, Elizabeth. I know I owe you something from a couple of years ago. But it's a great pleasure for me to be here today to speak to you all. Let me begin by thanking Elena Funke for the invitation to join this very distinguished group of speakers in the FeBo series. I also want to echo her thanks and thank the team that's been working with her on FeBo, particularly Claudia Biagetti, who I worked with quite closely to get this all together, but also Sebastian Scharf, Roy van Wyk, Rebecca Massinelli, Costantino Ferrarese, and Alicia Rieti, all of you for the work you've done on this tremendous series. Let me also say I'm going to proceed here on a kind of a high level today, and I'm going to talk about larger issues, particularly the FeBo theme of border management and whether and how federalism intersects with the question of border management and frontiers. I'm not going to be getting down so much into the nuts and bolts, if you can use that expression, English expression of all of this. I'm going to be keeping a kind of a high level and looking at the question of the Aitolian Koinon and the Amphiktyonea, the Paleo-Delphic Amphiktyonea, as two parallel institutions and how they intersect in the 3rd century. But that's going to require me to go back and talk about the earlier history of the Amphiktyonea, because I think that's very important for understanding what happens with in the 3rd century with the Aitolians and Amphiktyonea. I also want to preface my remarks by saying that, and as some of you know, I've been away from this for a while. My life took me into the dark world of academic administration for a number of years. And so Elena's invitation and FeBo's invitation came at a perfect time. I've recently retired, and so I'm now returning to think about all these things after 20 years of other people thinking about them, producing all sorts of wonderful scholarly work, which I'm still reflecting on as I put this presentation together. So please do treat what I'm about to say as very much a work in progress. I hope it's in the spirit of FeBo. FeBo is a seminar format for us here. So this is some thoughts and comments to add to the conversation that's been going on for the last 2 years. And again, thank you so much for the invitation. Okay, so I'm going to read my presentation here, and I hope you'll excuse me as I do this. And I'm going to turn off my video camera also too, just to concentrate on the script. So the 3rd century BC symbiosis of the Delphic Anthelic Amphictyonia and the upstart Koinon of the Aitolians. See if that switched for you. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm having a little bit of technical problem here. Where is it? There it is. Very good. Here we go. There we go. So the 3rd century symbiosis of these two institutions offers an interesting case for the question of federalism and border management in Greek antiquity. Both entities arose from regional cultic communities with roots stretching back into deep time. The Amphictyonia, including communities frequenting the sanctuary of Demeter at Anthela and Apollo at Delphi, whereas the Koinon or the Aitolians arose from the communities around the sanctuary of Apollo at Thermon and Artemis Laphria at Calydon. Upon these foundations, disparate local communities developed structures and institutions of regional identity and administration across the Archaic and Classical eras, one of whose motivations was certainly the reduction of violence / the mediation of conflict between member communities and individuals. Prior to the 4th century, however, what relationship, if any, there was between these two neighboring communities remains somewhat opaque, notably with the possible exception of the Aetolian Locrians, that is the West Locrians. The earliest membership of the Paleo-Delphic Amphictyonia, as its name implies, embraced communities around Anthela in the east, broadly speaking, that is, east and north of the Parnassus Massif. The Aetolian community, on the other hand, was westward and southward facing, with communications, connections, and concerns directed toward the Gulf of Corinth. And this is a map from modern transit and interests, but I think it still reflects the situation in antiquity, particularly where the Aetolians are looking towards the north coast of the Gulf of Corinth, at least from the Naupactia in the east through the territories of Calydon and Plevron, as the presentation in this series by our colleague Nikos Petrochilos demonstrated, and then also the Achelos Draconis basin from the Gulf of Ambrakia south as far as Aeneadae, as Claudia Antonetti's presentation has shown. And indeed, it's just the latest in our long series of engagements that have revolutionized our understanding of the Northwest Greek world as a coherent region. Through the middle of the 4th century BC, any Aetolian Pan-Hellenic imagination seems to have focused on Olympia, not on Delphi. By the middle of the 3rd century, however, the situation had evolved. The Aetolian Koinon and the Paleo-Delphic Amphictyonia had become thoroughly intertwined. Not only were the Aetolians represented on the Synedrion, the council that governed the Paleo-Delphic Amphictyonia, but their delegation kept growing. Apparently, as more and more of the smaller ethne that were traditional constituent parties of the Amphictyonia became members, in some sense, of the Aetolian Koinon as well. Now, modern scholars, as Elena Franchi pointed out, have sometimes viewed this development in negative terms, with ambitious Aetolians malevolently sallying forth from their mountainous home territory to seize Delphi and exploit the Amphictyonia in the great game that was interstate diplomacy and conflict in the 3rd century Hellenistic world. And it is certainly true that the Aetolians and their Koinon did use Delphi and the Amphictyonia in the 3rd century and early 2nd centuries in that context. But a review of that broader regional context over a more extended period of time offers reasons to wonder whether this was in fact a hostile takeover of one community, that is the Amphictyonia, by another, the Koinon, that is a forceful reordering of established borders, or rather a gradual merging of those communities for mutual benefit, particularly the maintenance of frontiers of power and authority against the hegemonic ambitions of the rulers of Macedonia. As I hope to suggest, we're going to see that these frontiers remain somewhat fluid and porous, and they only harden as one neared the approaches to the ancestral territories of the Aitolian ethnos. So let me begin here then, that's my overview. Begin by following my predecessors in providing a basic overview of the geography/topography of the Amphictyonic region. Jeremy McInerney, in his groundbreaking study on Phokis, the folds of Parnassus, riffed the Theban Epaminondas' supposed reference to Boeotia as Ares' dancing floor to suggest that Phokis was the chessboard on which a long series of matches played out among the states and powers of the Greek mainland. And I would extend that metaphor to the entire Amphictyonic neighborhood, but I would add that the Amphictyonic chessboard was three-dimensional. And here is an isochron of the area around Kallipolis or Callion as well here, just to show you about the topography and how difficult it can be in this area. Our area of interest was indeed one of the key nodes of the political ecology of Aegean Greece, but as I said, it's a three-dimensional chessboard. Our core area consists of a network of interlocking, overlapping physical and environmental zones that acted to produce a mosaic of smallish rival human communities. Its northern limit may be drawn by the ridge and highland chains that run roughly from Mount Othrys in the east to Mount Timphristos in the west. The lowlands south of this line encompass the Spercheios River Valley watershed, itself bounded on the south by another ridge line that passes eastward through Mounts Kokkalia and Gulina to Mount Oita. At Oita, the chain forks with one branch, Kallidromos Knemis, running easterly to the intersection of the Malian and Euboean Gulfs. And then a land route along that shore is constricted at Thermopylae, the site of many a military confrontation, most famously that in 480 BC, where the passage was extremely narrow and the alluviation from the Spercheios Basin has since broadened it considerably. So returning to Mount Iti or Oita, its second branch runs southwesterly as far as Helicon, but its dominant feature is the Parnassus Massif, among whose southern folds sits the oracular shrine of Apollo at Delphi. Kallidromos and Knemis and Parnassus in turn, bound a lowland region whose upper reaches were watered by the Pindos and whose other stream and other streams that fed the Kaphissus River, which itself then grew into a major watercourse on the basin, emptying eventually into the Copaic fenland. In terms of the region's larger political ecology, its environmental features fostered both divisions and connections within its human inhabitants. A series of micro-regions and identities developed at least by the Archaic era. And so we have Aenos Leonianes here in the upper Spercheios Valley, Malis and the Malians in its lower reaches as far as the eponymous Gulf of Malis. And then along the Euboean Channel were Locris and the Locrians. South of the Kallidromos Knemis were the Dorians in the upland of the Pindos Valley. And then we have Phokis and the Phokians from the narrows between the settlements from Dromia and Karadra, southeast to the area of Hyambopolis and Abai, and then southward toward Bulis on the Gulf of Corinth across from Antikyra. Beyond that nebulous line lay the plain of Boeotia, which bookended our region to the south and the east, just as the Great Plain of Thessaly along the Peneus River abuts it to the north. Now, the population of these small microregions adopted a loose community form in sociological terms, the ethnos, and the physical boundaries between them were somewhat fluid and often contested. That general pattern in human geography rose at least in part in response to the region's physical geography, which varied from river valleys of varying extent and fertility to uplands to montane regions. These ethne vied for access and control over the fruits, sometimes quite literally, of these various environments, both with each other and increasingly as time passed, internally, as individual settlements struggled to maintain themselves against encroachments by neighboring communities within their ethnos. A counterpoint to this competition was provided by sites of shared supernatural significance within each of the microregions, at which the local population gathered since time immemorial to interface with the divine, in the process providing another basis for the emergence of shared identity. One of the key advances in our understanding of the significance of these cult centers is the recognition of the importance of the socioeconomic exchanges that occurred at their festivals, that is, the very feasting, in the establishment, maintenance, and expansion of the bonds of identity within the region. As in other regions of the Greek world, so in ours in turn, across the archaic area, some of these local gathering spaces gained broader significance, surpassing the human and physical boundaries of their original constituencies. The earliest to do so grew to be a key nodal point for our region. This is the sanctuary of Demeter at Anthela, located here, as you can see, hard by the thermal springs that give the adjacent pass of Thermopylae its name. And here we are at the Thermopylae Pass, looking to where the sanctuary of Demeter Anthela is located. And you can also then see here the modern thermal baths, the spa that's located also there as well. The precise origins of the sanctuary are obscure, but suffice to say here that it was most likely initially, or first came to prominence, I should say, as a focus of Malian ethnic identity. By about 600 BCE, however, Anthela and its shrine had become the center of a community embracing a broader range of surrounding ethne, that is, an Amphiktonia. Other such associations of, quote, dwellers around, unquote, are known from the same period, such as that at Calauria, encompassing the communities around the Saronic Gulf. But the Anthelic Amphiktonia is best known because of developments at another shrine of central Greece that had gained a broader significance in the early Archaic era as well. And that shrine was the shrine of Apollo at Delphi to its south. Now, if the cultic community around Demeter at Anthela had become regional across the Archaic period, that of her mythic brother Apollo at Delphi was becoming panhellenic during the same years. A major reason was the growing reputation of the associated oracle there, the Pythia. Among the phenomena marking the transition from geometric and archaic to archaic Greece in Greek history was a demographic explosion manifested in the first great wave of colonization. As various organizers sought divine guidance for their endeavors, the Pythia's prognostications were unsurpassed, and grateful suppliants showered the oracle and the Apollo shrine with gifts. And increasing traffic to the shrines brought further prosperity to the area. Not surprisingly, neighboring communities sought to take advantage of Delphi's prominence, perhaps even to control the shrine and the community itself. Events seem to have come to a head around 600 BCE in a murky conflict that is conventionally, if now erroneously, referred to as the First Sacred War. Now, among the surprising aspects of this conflict was its apparent aftermath, the placing of the Delphic sanctuary under the oversight of the Anthelic Amphiktonia. When we finally emerge into more securely documented times, the Anthelic Amphiktonia has become a Delphic Anthelic hybrid with two meetings called the Pulaia of its Synedrian Council per year, one in the spring at the Demeter Sanctuary at Anthela, one in the autumn at the Sanctuary of Apollo at Delphi. Attending the meetings were 24 sacral delegates, hieromnemones, plus ministers to the sessions Pulagorai. Now, aside from the location of the spring gathering at Anthela, the anthelic origins of this body are evident in its participants. Apportioned by ethne, a large block of these representatives hail from the small regions just discussed here. Other participants, however, point towards a likely author of the merging of these sacred communities. Pride of place in subsequent Amphiktyonic delegations was generally held by the Hieronymus from Thessaly. And in the 7th and early 6th centuries, that is across the early Archaic period, while polities and lands to the south were still in the process of coalescing, great families had consolidated control over the large population and resources that the Peneus could provide in Thessaly. Having then established dominance over the communities on their periphery, that is the Magnetes, here the Paribæans, the Dolopians, the Phthiotians here as well, the Thessalians then set their sights on bringing the lands and peoples further south under their sway. And according to Herodotus, they were still at it a century later in the years just before the Persian invasion of 480. And the ancient tradition does include the Thessalians among the possible protectors of Delphi during the conflict of the early 6th century, so making them a likely author of this merging of the Anthelic and Delphic sanctuaries. Well, if the rulers of Thessaly were behind the bringing of the Delphi within the orbit of the Anthelic Amphiktyonea, any hopes they may have had of utilizing the revised body as an instrument of their regional pretensions do not seem to have been realized. According to Herodotus, the Thessalians were among the most prominent of the Greek communities that sided with the Persians in the invasion of 480, prioritizing their parochial interests over any sense of Pan-Hellenic solidarity. They were joined by other Amphiktyonic ethne, including the Dolopians, the Aenianes, the Paribæans, the Locrians, the Magnesians, the Malians, the Achaeans of Theotis, Thebans, and all the Boeotians except the men of Thespiae and Plataea. So here's a list, or here are all of the various Amphiktyonic communities that sided with the Persians. This mass submission does not seem, however, to have been an Amphiktyonic decision. The Phocians, for example, resisted, as did the Ionians, that is, the Athenians and Euboeans, the Dorians, the Peloponnesians, and probably the Metropolitan Dorians, and the people of Delphi itself. So here are those who resisted the Persians, who have associations with the Amphiktyonea. Moreover, the Locrians changed their mind and helped with the defense of Thermopylae with all their strength, while the Thebans vacillated. Furthermore, the Greek alliance against the Persians swore on oath, quote, that if they should be victorious, they would dedicate to the god of Delphi the possessions of all the Greeks who had of free will surrendered themselves to the Persians, that is, of all these Amphiktyonic peoples. A century or so after its reorganization, therefore, the Delphic and Thelic Amphiktyonea shows no signs of having evolved further into a tighter political community capable of commanding the loyalty and resources of its members for common action on a grander scale. As if to reinforce this impression, an attempt by Sparta in 479 in the aftermath of the Battle of Plataea to overhaul the Amphiktyonea yet again, purging the Medizers and repopulating in such a way as to make it malleable to Spartan leadership, failed. Addressing an Amphiktyonic meeting, apparently as a delegate from Athens, Themistocles successfully convinced the Synhedrion to reject the Spartan proposal, explicitly arguing against allowing the Amphiktyonea to become politicized. The recent oath of the allies seems also not to have been enforced, and at least some of the battlefield monuments subsequently set up at Thermopylae were commissioned by the Amphiktyonea, despite most of its members having been on the Persian side. Given the proximity of Anthela to Thermopylae, the Amphiktyonea here seems simply to be exercising its traditional role and its traditional authority over the local sacred environment. On the larger stage of Delphi, the Amphictyonians' role seems also to have remained similarly circumscribed and sacral. Maintenance of the temple and sanctuary, including arbitration of disputes within that jurisdiction, and especially responsibility for the production of the great Pythian festival that occurred every 4 years. Now, there's no indication across the following century, the 5th century, that is, that the Amphictyonians' nature or role expanded or evolved any further. Thucydides, in fact, barely makes mention of the body. The fact that is all the more surprising as so many of the key political and military events of the 5th century and the early 4th century as well played out on the Amphictyonic chessboard. To note only a few, pressure by the Phocians on the neighboring communities of Doris in the early 450s led that community to appeal to their Spartan kin, who dispatched an army that not only drove back the Phocians, but en route back to the Peloponnese, set off a 10-year conflict with Athens over Boeotia and control of Boeotia and central Greece. This struggle was bookended by another Spartan expedition, this one to restore control of the temple at Delphi to the locals, presumably in response to a Phocian takeover, since Athens then responded by restoring Phocian control. 2 decades later, during the Archidamian War, the Dorians once again appealed to Sparta for assistance, this time in conjunction with the Malians around Trachis. Both were suffering predations from a different direction, the inhabitants of the Oita Massif. The Spartans' response was innovative. The establishment of a colony duly endorsed by the Pythia, sited on a defensible outcrop of Oita just above the old settlement at Trachis. And this is the site of Heraclea. Thucydides emphasizes that this Spartan move was strategic, giving them as it did a stronghold dominating the lower Sperakios plain of Malis. And this is a view from the Acropolis at Heraclea, looking out towards the Malian Gulf, and you can see where the arrow shows you that Anthela and Thermopylae are just around the low hills off in the distance there, and that's the Asopus River running down through the middle of it. So this position at Heraclea gave them a dominant position there, but it also gave them a position dominating the transit routes to the north through Phaeotis, which would go up this way, as well as along through Thermopylae here. But from there also, that is to say Heraclea, another pass at Gravia opened to the south and lead to a reasonably easy route at the interface of Oita and Mount Parnassus, going down through this way here, and from there down to the west and into the plain dominated by Amphissa here in western, at the tip of western Locris. And just around the corner from Delphi, Delphi isn't quite on this map here, as well as leading directly across the Gulf of the Corinth from the Peloponnese. In Thucydides' narrative of the immediately following events to this in 426 again, Messenians at Naupactus trace this route in reverse in explaining to the Athenian general Demosthenes why he should lead an expedition into Aetolia. And this is the route that Thucydides says that the Messenians told Demosthenes he could take. The point is not the conquest of the Aetolians, although the Demosthenes invasion, the Athenian invasion, was in fact the first major appearance by the Aetolians as a polity in the extant ancient narrative. But the point wasn't the conquest of this, wasn't the conquest of the Aetolians, but the pressuring of the West Locrians to allow the Athenians the route to Doris, whence the Athenians could exert pressure on the Phocians and then the Boeotians. So this is all Amphictyonic territory. A Spartan counter expedition did organize it and set off from Delphi, but it is characterized not by any Amphictyonic coherence or focus, but rather the opposite. It was supported by the Amphictyons, who themselves were motivated, according to Thucydides, by hostility towards them of the Phocians. And the Amphictyons and a string of the other West Locrian communities rendered hostages who were then deposited in Doris, in Koinon. Other West Locrian communities resisted, however, as the expedition headed towards its goal, which was Navpaktas, i.e., it headed away from the core of the Amphiktyonea. And so to sum all of this up, and all of this, Thucydides makes no mention of the Puleo-Delphic Amphiktyonea. Delphi does make an appearance in the terms of the so-called Peace of Nicias of 421, but what is noteworthy about that mention is that all the parties agree to is to respect Delphi's independence and rights of self-governance. Now that situation changes in the early 4th century. As it progressed, evidence, mostly epigraphic, for the Amphiktyonia's activities grows, including its deepening entanglement in the broader political scene. Alongside an inscription from circa 380 that documents the lengthy oath taken by Hieronymenes when they were acting as adjudicators, comes a long series of inscriptions recording the Amphiktyonia's management over many decades of repairs in the temple district following a massive earthquake in 373. The late 360s, however, produce a pair of Amphiktyonic judgments, one against Sparta, the other against a group of Phocians, both unprecedented examples of the body striking out against a member. The most important upshot of this activism was, of course, the seizure of Delphi by the Phocians in the early 350s. And this map shows you then the various alignments involved in this, sometimes called the Third Sacred War, but in fact is the only real sacred war as far as we know. Their use of the Amphiktyonic, they used Amphiktyonic funds to sustain their military occupation for a decade in the face of assaults by fellow Amphiktyonic members, Thessaly and Boeotia. This stalemate opened the door, famously for Philip II of Macedonia to intervene and then utilize the Amphiktyoniae in turn as a cover for his reordering of the political order of the mainland. This included the Amphiktyonia's expulsion of the Phocians and the granting of their 2 votes on the council to Philip. So here's the new Amphiktyonea of the 330s, along with the Amphiktyoniaes ordering the leveling of Phocis fortified settlements and scattering their population into villages, and the imposition of an indemnity to recoup the Amphiktyonic funds hijacked by the Phocians. Now, when we turn to the Amphiktyonea of the 3rd century, it's easy to recognize parallels between Philip's intervention and involvement in the 340s and 330s and that of the Aitolian Koinon. The Aetolians' later engagement certainly drew on events of the 3rd quarter of the 4th century for inspiration and precedent, and I would like to suggest, in fact, that the Macedonians' earlier actions were more broadly foundational for later Aetolian behavior than is sometimes recognized. Just as for Philip, so for the Aetolian Koinon, the Amphiktyonic Council was a means to an end beyond the cultural cachet of its traditional management of one of the premier loci of Pan-Hellenic identity. For Philip, the Amphiktyonea was a springboard to his League of Corinth and its expansion subjective vis-a-vis the Achaemenid Empire. For the Aetolians, the goal was literally more parochial, one might almost say Amphiktyonic, and thoroughly in line with the subject of this series of seminars. It was the protection of the eastern frontier of their Koinon. So allow me at this point to leap ahead in time and offer a brief overview of Les Aitolians à Delphes, to borrow the title of Robert Flossier's monumental 1937 study, which remains fundamental nearly a century after its appearance. A rare combination of literary and epigraphic sources, and here we have a picture of the polygonal wall at Delphi, and you can see the inscriptions on it. These are the inscriptions that we're going to be working, or many of the inscriptions I'll be talking about here. A rare combination of literary and epigraphic sources inform us that in early 278, most likely the spring Pulaia, the Council of the Amphiktyonea chose to reverse its decision of the mid-340s and restore to the Phocian ethnos its 2 traditional votes. 2 other Hieronymus in the list, where the Phocians reappear, bear an ethnic identity new to the Amphiktynia, however. They are Aitolians. Why of these actions also bears similarities to the circumstances around the equally novel granting of 2 votes to the Macedonian Philip in the 340s, a defense of Delphi against outside threat. In the Aetolian Phocian case, their opponents were genuine others, a large Celtic warband that in preceding years had marauded its way down into central Greece from the north, leaving in their wake a dead Macedonian monarch and general socio-political anarchy. In response, the Aitolian Koinon dispatched a considerable portion of its military manpower to block the exits out of the Malian plain at Thermopylae and Heraclea, joined, as noted, by a large Phocian force and other contingents hurrying north from Boeotia, Athens, and Polities further south. And so here is the coalition that gathered at Thermopylae in 479. This force initially stopped the Gaulish advance for a week. The Gauls then responded by sending a flying column north and west of Mount Oita that fell suddenly and unexpectedly on eastern Aetolia via the Bistritsa and Megas river valleys. And here is the probable route they took to get around Thermopylae. The main victim of this assault was the region's major urban agglomeration, Callion, now underdefended with its men away at Thermopylae, which the Gauls brutally sacked. Word of that atrocity caused at least some of the Aetolians at Thermopylae to hurry home, allowing the Gauls to circumvent the pass and head towards Delphi. An ad hoc group of Amphissians, Phocians, and Aetolians then stopped them there, assisted, of course, by the obligatory intervention of the local deity. And Aetolians then led the way in chasing the remaining Gauls north, joined by forces from a number of other states of central and southern Greece. Well, if the Amphiktyonic decision to award the Aetolians 2 votes on the council in recognition of their efforts and sacrifices mirrored their earlier reward to Philip, the sequel to that reward in subsequent years and decades was unprecedented. As Fleslyer and his predecessors in Delphic epigraphy so persuasively have demonstrated, Amphiktyonic records dating to the years down to the first decades of the 2nd century document further progressive growth in the number of Aetolian hieromonemes on the council, peaking around 221, 217 at 15 seats. Fleslyer and his colleagues further noted the contemporary disappearance from these Amphiktyonic lists of individuals identified as representing many of the smaller Amphiktyonic ethne that had traditionally comprised the council. One common modern conclusion is that this phenomenon marks the progressive conquest of these smaller regions by an expansionist Aetolian Koinon, who then shamelessly seized their votes to offer at least a thin veneer of legitimacy to their naked aggression. This view is bolstered by a consideration of other Aetolian behavior toward the sanctuary at Delphi during these same years. Dedications by or to Aetolians or individual Aetolians proliferate at the Delphic shrine, including Gallic shields hung from the temple. And here we have one of the metopes and triglyphs. It's from the temple. This one is behind the temple. If you go to visit Delphi, you'll see it there. And you can see on this one the imprint of the Gallic shield and the connections that held it in place here as well. So these were hung all around the temple, on the backside of the temple. And also there were statues dedicated around the sanctuary, including a statue personifying Aetolia, which was probably located about here, and whose base we have found. There it is on the left, and to the right here is the restoration commonly used of what the statue would have looked like. As well as, in addition to the statue, then also further statues of the officers who led the defense against the Gauls. And on top of that, the Gallic arms, which had been seized after their defeat, were displayed in the West Stoa here, sometimes called the Stoa of the Aitolians. Now, the placement of all of these dedications in juxtaposition with those associated with the defense of Velta against the Persians was clearly not accidental. Then if we move forward a decade or so more, we get more local likenesses of the Koinon's tutelar deities, grouped with those of generals who had led to victory over the Acarnanians. And this monument is placed along the Sacred Way, that avenue of interhellenic anguish, near the Spartan victory monument for the Battle of Aegospotami, announcing its hegemony in Greece, and the Arcadian dedication to commemorate the destruction of the Spartan hegemony a generation later. So the dedication and the placement of these new Aetolian monuments can and has been seen as a conscious placing on Delphi of an Aetolian stamp, marking the Koinon as the new hegemon. Can it be coincidence that in these same years, the Aetolian delegation assumes the first place on the lists of the Amphictyons, a position traditionally held by the Thessalians, or that a new Amphictyonic officer, a grammateus, who is always an Aetolian, appears? Moreover, we have contemporary decrees of the Koinon that forbid the extradition from Aetolian polis of individuals condemned by the Amphictyonic Council, except where the condemned had stolen sacred items, i.e. dedications, from Delphi. We also have another inscription that suggests the Koinon assumed the further right to act as a court of appeals against Amphictyonic judgments, even those against non-Aetolians. Moreover, as the Aetolians adopted the habit of granting asulia to further off polities, these decrees sometimes include grants of immunity to the Aetolians' new friends, and immunity from the Amphictyonic indictments. And the justification is that they're doing so because the new friends, just as if they were Aetolians, hos Aitolon onton. The Koinon can be said to have intruded as well on the Amphictyonia's other main domain, the organization of festive competitions and games. Oversight of the Pythian Games was the most important of these, but in the aftermath of the Gaulish incursion, the council had created an additional annual celebration of thanksgiving to the gods for the protection of the sanctuary, the soteria. By the early 240s, however, the Aetolian Koinon had stepped in and taken control. They had raised the status of the soteria's musical contests to the level of those of the Pythia, added gymnastic and equestrian events on the level of the Nemean Games, and changed the celebration from an annual to a pentateric event, all under the direction of an Aetolian producer, an Agonothetes. But perhaps most provocatively as well, in this very same period, the Aetolian Koinon took upon itself to grant a vote on the Amphictyonic Council to a new, even more remote participant, the island of Chios. And in subsequent years, they extended that same privilege to Magnesia and the Meander, as well as Cephallenia and Athemania. And with these actions, one might rightly ask whether the old Delphic and Thelic Amphictyonia had simply been absorbed into the newer Aetolian federal state, the Aetolian Koinon. And these further out grants are where I got the idea for the clever title I gave to this, that is to say, of a Koinon sans frontières, although as we'll see, I think that's probably not correct. Let me begin by some further examination of this and other evidence, which I think permits a less cynical interpretation of the Aetolian Koinon's relationship with the Amphictyonia. For all the evidence I just sketched out of increasing Aetolian involvement in the affairs of the Amphictyonia, there are countervailing signs of normalcy and restraint. The Pythia, for example, continues to be celebrated during the Aetolian period, alongside the new Soteria festival. And the Amphictyonia continued to oversee management of the sanctuary just as before, as demonstrated by a billing account from the same period, actually after the Chians received their vote. And this account, I put it up here just so you can get a look at how dense the text is and how much, very much is in line with the the documents of a century before. So we see alongside it as well a plethora of documents from the city of Delphi, attesting the continuing function of its traditional organs of self-governance while the Aitolians are there. Indeed, an Aitolian decree from the later 240s makes a very public display of continued respect for the sovereignty of the sacred city by specifying that any grants of ateleia at Delphi were to be valid only in cases where the Delphians themselves had certified the award. And even the grant of the Amphiktyonic votes to Chios bears mark of Aetolian deference, where if you look at the inscription announcing it, it is a degree of thanks by the Chios to the Aetolians. But the wording of the document itself indicates that it was not the Aetolian Assembly, but the Amphiktyonic Council that gave sanction for the change in representation. The Amphiktyonic lists that document the growth of Aetolian delegation also support the counter-narrative I'm presenting here. Most notably, they reveal the strange case of the wandering East Locrian vote. And to summarize it, an East Locrian representative is found in all four of the known Amphiktyonic lists that date between the admittance of the Aetolians and the full session of 273. And here you'll see them, 277, 1 Locrian, 276.5, 274, and 273. At the spring session of 272, however, there is no Locrian delegate. Well, in the session in the fall that follows it, the Boeotian delegation has risen to 3. Soon after, the situation returns to its previous state. Locrians are back, albeit with demotic designations here from Alponi here, and then from the Epicnemidians here, and then later we have representation as a Scarphaean here as well. But in the late 360s, the Locrian delegation again disappears, this time permanently. And what we initially find is that the Phocians have added a vote here, 3 Phocians right here. But then by the early 250s, the Aetolians have added a vote, and the Phocians are back to 2 here. What we're seeing here, I would suggest, is simply a reflection of a resumption of the ethnic rivalries within the Amphictyonia that had beset it since its inception. That is to say, that there is continuity of what's going on with the Delphic and Anthiolic Amphictyonia under Aetolian leadership. And other epigraphic testimony further suggests this. And in fact, it suggests that the denouement to the East Locrian question was not a display of raw Aetolian power, but rather a not unwelcome solution to an age-old territorial conflict. For within a decade of the first Aetolian representation on the Amphiktyonic Council, inscriptions from the primary Aetolian sanctuary, that is the Apollo sanctuary at Thermon, reveal an officer of the Koinon's executive who is as unprecedented as our Aetolians on the Amphiktyonic Council. Around 272, a certain Polycharmos, who is here, shows up serving as in the position of grammateus, that is secretary of the council, which is one of the most important positions. But his demotic is given as Heracleota, or from Heraclea. Now, Pausanias reports that the Aetolians had taken control of Heraclea and Trachis just prior to the Gallic incursion of 279, so it seems most likely that that site was Polycharmus's home. So evidently, within a few years of 280, the Aetolian Koinon had decided to extend membership in its polity to that community, even though it lay outside of what Thucydides and his contemporaries would have considered the boundaries of the Aetolian ethnos. In the light of the past couple decades of scholarship demonstrating the malleability of ethnic identities in the Greek world, this specific case is not especially groundbreaking, but what is noteworthy for present purposes is the string of other examples that follow in both the epigraphic and literary record for the Aetolian Koinon and the following century, where individuals from Heraclea Hupata, and other traditionally Amphiktyonic lands hold the League's highest office, the strategia, on a not infrequent basis. The phenomenon of the expansion of, quote, Aitolian, unquote, as a political identity is even clearer in the Amphiktyonic records of the later 3rd and early 2nd centuries. These adopt the practice of identifying the members of each delegation not just by ethnos, but also by demotic. And here we see among the Aitolian delegation identified as Aitolians, not just individuals from Koinon and from Caledon, which are down here inside of what we consider traditional Aitolian territory, or Kallipolis, but also from Scarpheia and Lamia and Melitea, Thamaki, from Theotic Thebes. Even Pharsalus and Gomphi are on the edges of the Thessalian plain here as well. So one of the clearest indications of an old Amphiktyonic ethne's embrace of Aitolianness, however, is provided by one of the most recent additions to our record, the now famous inscription from the Lettere at Xanthos in Lycia. Dating from the year 206-205 BCE, it records a visit to Xanthos by residents of Koinon, who are also identified as Dorians of the metropolis and ambassadors of the Aitolian Koinon. So we're getting here an indication of a tri-level identity of these individuals. They are Koinonians, they are also Dorians of the metropolis, but they are also Aitolians. Now, a long-known inscription from the late 260s indicates that the metropolitan Dorians had already become Aitolians by that point, since it lists among the League's financial officers a Timandrou Irenaeus. And here is the inscription. It's the famous Aetolian Acarnanian peace treaty. Here, the syntheke between them here as well. And back to Doris, there's where Irenaeus is. So we have Timandros of Irenaeus in the late 260s, from when this this document dates, is already serving as in the Aetolian executive. The Xanthos inscription not only confirms that earlier development, that is, that Dorians consider themselves Aetolians, but also indicates that they're happy about this. The Koinonians here seek assistance from the Xanthians and employ in their argument not only their heroic ancestor, that is, their Amphiktyonic bona fides, including yet another defense of Delphi in the recent past, but also their membership in the Aetolian Koinon and its friendship and shared ancestry with Xanthos. Now, the reason for their long journey and request further brings us back to the theme of the seminar. For the Koinonians here were seeking funding to repair the fortifications of their town, which had been destroyed in a recent conflict. That is, they were motivated by a desire to strengthen their control over the borders of their territory and, by extension, those of the Aetolian Koinon to which they belonged. And what I'd like to do in the time remaining here is to argue, in fact, that the entire phenomenon of the Aetolian Amphiktyonic relationship with the 3rd and early 2nd centuries might have been built upon this same foundation of border control. Among the Xanthos inscription's major revelations, and here we have a later section of the document, alongside the destruction of the fortification of the Koinonians and other Dorians, was the identity of their antagonist, Antigonus III Doson, king of Macedonia. His incursion in the early 220s was, however, only the latest in a long series of Macedonian aggressions into Amphiktyonic lands, going back as far as Philip II. Initially peripheral to the lands, and so the interest of the old Aetolian polity, the increasing Macedonian intervention in central Greece across the reigns of Philip, Alexander, and Alexander's successors drew the increasing attention and involvement of the Aetolians in lands to their east. Their responses, ironically, set the stage for the events of 279 that served to launch the gradual Aetolian Amphiktyonic symbiosis that followed. So let me sketch this out briefly. If we look at the events leading to Philip's intervention in central Greece in the mid-4th century, the Aetolian polity is notable by its absence. And this is especially striking for a number of reasons, primarily because as our colleagues Peter Funke, Claudia Antonetti, Emily Mackel, who herself is drawing on the works of the Dutch Aetolian Studies Project under Peter Doorn, Sebastian Beaumoyer, and their colleagues, as they and others have all shown, the 5th and 4th centuries were a time of tremendous internal development among the populations of the Aetolian hinterland, which Thucydides even describes already in his day as being considerable. This included the establishment of increasingly complex institutions of regional governance in response to the emergence of ever larger settlements among the scatter of small unwalled villages that Thucydides describes. Yet, aside from inclusion in a list of ethne who supported one of Philip's peace overtures, the Aetolians are absent from the reasonably abundant narrative, literary, and epigraphic sources for Philip's activities in central Greece. What evidence we do have for collective Aetolian interests in the middle years of the 4th century indicates a westward and southward orientation. And here I go back to my map from before. Toward the north coast of the Gulf of Corinth, Nafpaktia and Aeolus, and the middle and lower reaches of the Achelous Valley towards Oeniadae. Now, if we go back to topography and geography, the high mountain complex that stretches like an inverted fishhook from Mount Giona here in the south, around through Iti, and then through the Corax mountain chain up here, this entire massif as well seems to have formed, if not a complete barrier, at least a formidable frontier to the east and northeast of the Aetolians. These surroundings probably also fostered the emergence at the area center of Callion or Callipolis here, the Aetolians' largest inland conurbation. While Philip's forays to his south did include intrusions into areas of Aetolian concern to their west, his major interaction with the Koinon seems to have involved the ceding to it of the long-coveted Nafpaktos. And here I'm showing you the view from the Acropolis at Nafpaktos, so you can get a sense of why the Aetolians may have wanted to gain control over it. You can see the Peloponnese here, the Achaean Mountains as well, and the entire Gulf of Corinth stretching out. So this is something certainly that they would have liked. The same years probably also saw, according to the Aetolians, a privileged access pro mantia to the Oracle at Delphi, but all other indications are that the Koinon's collective attention remained towards their western frontier. Dissatisfaction with Philip's actions in that area may indeed have prompted this nebulous Aetolian support for Thebes' rebellion at the beginning of Alexander's reign. And control over the lower Achelous and Oeniadae clearly led to open conflict between the Aetolians and Alexander in his final years. And so let's look, we're still looking west for Aetolia's attention. They're interested in Oeniadae over here. It was only the sequel to this dispute over the western boundaries that drew the Aetolian attention to their eastern reaches and central Greece in a serious and sustained way. Approached in Alexander's final years by Athens to join in a rebellion against Macedonian domination of the mainland, the Aetolians agreed. In the aftermath of Alexander's sudden death, for the first time, we have clear evidence of the dispatch of a significant Aetolian force into lands beyond their eastern border. The composition of the so-called Hellenic alliance that they joined further suggests this event may have been the true beginning of the Koinon's subsequent engagement with the Delphic and Thelic Amphictyonia. As you can see here, the contingents in the Hellenic alliance are largely drawn from the Amphictyonia. Along with the contingents from many of the Amphictyones, these Aetolians helped stop a Macedonian army from crossing the Malian plain, blockading it in Lamia. Hence, the popular name for this conflict is called the Lamian War, although contemporary documents suggest that the Allies referred to it as the Hellenic War. The novelty of the Aitolians' involvement is further reflected in its inconstancy. As the siege of Lamia dragged on, the Aitolians chose to go home to deal with pressing matters there. Their departure contributed in no small way to the collapse of the Hellenic coalition. But the Macedonians were not about to reward the Aitolians for their fecklessness. Having dealt with other participants, the Macedonians carried out in 321 an invasion of Aetolia whose magnitude and duration is not immediately apparent from the compressed narrative in our main source, Diodorus. Only the eruption of the first of the civil wars of Alexander's successors spared the Aetolians a complete disaster. And the Koinon's consistent involvement in the ensuing struggles of the Diadochi suggests the epical nature of this invasion of 321. In particular, the focus of that Macedonian attack seems to have been the communities of Eastern Aetolia and the routes of transit they controlled between East and West Central Greece. Now, again, I'm not going to rehearse here all of the various Aetolian interventions in Amphictyonic territories against Macedonian foes, primarily Cassandros, in the final decades of the 4th century, but suffice it to say that it was most likely during these conflicts that the Aetolian Koinon moved to establish control over the mountainous lands to their east and the passes they contained, including the Narrows, the cleft way that commands the route from Delphi from the east. While many scholars attribute this move to an Aetolian desire to take advantage of the chaos of those years to acquire the Panhellenic cachet of the oracle and sanctuary, I would suggest that their motivation lay more in trying to avoid a repeat of the terrible events of 321. And I would note here again the slow, hesitant course of Aetolian encroachment on the sanctuary and its controlling Amphictyonia. If Panhellenic prestige was the aim of the Aetolian advance into Delphi, the Koinon certainly took its time claiming it. As we have seen, it was the historical accident of their presence in 279 when the Gauls arrived on the scene, and the horrific price the eastern region of the traditional ethnos paid as a result, that precipitated the inclusion of Amphictyonic peoples, albeit slowly, within the Aetolian embrace in the decades following. There's little to indicate any such Aetolian behavior in the decades prior to the Gauls' arrival. And this despite attempts by at least 2 significant would-be defenders of Delphi to oust the Aetolians during these years. The first, in the 290s, was the sometime Macedonian monarch Demetrius I Poliorcetes, whose scattered literary and epigraphic morsels indicate attempted unsuccessfully to play Philip II to the Aetolians, Phocians, and Amphictyons. In 280, an even more venerable champion of Delphi appeared in the Spartans, led by their king Arius. The Aetolian siege of Heraclea was the Koinon's response. But the gap of nearly a decade thereafter before its citizens appear as Aetolian magistrates favor the view that the Koinon initially moved against Heraclea for its strategic control of access to Eastern Aetolia, rather than the long association of the peoples of Oita and Malus around it with the Delphic Anthelic Amphictyonia. And buttressing this interpretation is the fact that in the same years that the Aetolian delegates first appear in the Amphictyonic lists, Aetolian documents still treat West Locris as outside the Koinon. So here we have a document showing that Polycarmus of Heraclea is serving as grammateus of the Aetolian League, but the League itself, the Koinon, is granting to individuals from Amphissa isopoliteia and ecteia geis, that is, rights of citizenship and land ownership in Aetolia. That is to say that the Amphictyons are not yet in the League at the same time the Heracleids already are. And all this points yet again to something else motivating the Aetolians rather than a burning desire to simply take over the Paleo-Delphic Amphictyonia for the sake of their place in Hellenic political cultural hierarchy. Reviewing also then going forward the course of political events in the Amphictyonic zone across the remainder of the Aetolian hegemony, and here's where I'll begin to wrap up. There are numerous signs that a key concern of these communities involved was the management, in particular security, of the region's frontiers against Macedonian intrusions. Such an interpretation would certainly explain the apparent cold peace between the Aetolian Koinon and Antigonus II Gonatas, Demetrius's successor, during his long reign in the middle of the 3rd century. And perhaps recognizing the limits of Aetolian aims, say nothing of the strength of their position along the southern edge of the Spercheios Valley, Antigonus seems not to have contested the Aetolian presence. And for their part, the Aetolian Koinon appears not to have participated in resistance to Antigonus Gonatas, particularly the so-called Chromatidian War of the 260s. The decision of Antigonus's son, Demetrius II, in the 230s to reverse course only confirmed his father's acumen. The Aetolian resistance to Demetrius II was so effective that the Salian communities on the frontier between Macedonia and Aetolian spheres chose in the early 220s to step under the umbrella of Aetolianness at the meetings of the Amphictyonia. And here we have an indication of all of the various areas that were under Aetolian or showed up as Aetolians during the Amphictyonic meetings in the 220s. These same liminal Amphictyonic ethne and their constituent communities, as well as their more southerly peers, remained central to the conflicts that followed under Doson, as we have seen, and Philip V, his nephew. An Aetolian peak at the Romans' failure to return these communities to the Koinon in the years following the Roman defeat of Philip V at Caius led the Aetolians to solicit the intervention of Antiochus III into Greece. The early stages of that conflict again play out across the Amphictyonic lands. And after the Aetolians turned the passes at Thermopylae and drove Antiochus from Greece, they directed their knockout blow against the Aetolian Koinon towards the key sites protecting access to eastern Aetolia, Heraclea, Hypata. Having taken these, they proceeded across the Oita-Corax frontier to descend upon Naupactus, presumably laying waste the territories of Gallipolis and the rest of East Aetolia en route. The Aetolian Koinon soon sued for peace, and after fruitless negotiations and an unsuccessful resistance to another Roman incursion against their eastern region, they capitulated, surrendering themselves to the fides of their Roman opponents. Recognizing the importance to Aetolian power of their Amphictyonic constituency, the Romans expelled the Aetolians from Delphi and severed that tie. Let me sum up then by returning to some of our overarching questions for the FeBo seminar series. And I would suggest here that in reviewing the Aetolian Amphictyonic relationship of the third and early second centuries, we do indeed have an example of the federalization process contributing to the stabilization of regional border areas. Aetolianness, as I've called it, provided an expanding aegis under which the Amphictyonic communities of eastern and central Greece were able to limit access to their lands, that is, to control their perimeter, across several decades. The Xanthos inscription reveals, of course, that protection was not insuperable. Antigonus Doson was able to traverse metropolitan Doris and damage the fortifications of his major settlements, and Philip V later was also active in the region. But the Xanthos inscription also shows the Aetolian Koinon organizing the regional resistance of Amphictyonic lands to that outsider and actively supporting the reestablishment of defense infrastructure in that area. The intersection of Koinon and Amphictyonia seems also to have provided an umbrella under which member ethne communities could peaceably negotiate the boundary disputes that had set them at odds with each other since the Archaic era, if not before. Most notably here, one more inscription, two inscriptions, recording Melitaeans in Theotic Achaia, turning to the Koinon in the later 3rd century for judges to settle physical boundaries and other disputes with other communities within their Amphictyonic ethnos of Theotic Achaia, the Xenians and the Paraeans here. Those and other documents, however, indicate that the region's boundaries remained fluid and porous rather than fixed and linear. And whether we can call the establishment and manning of fortified sites to control key choke points of access to the region, or the deployment of manpower as needed to defend these portals against unwelcome visitors, whether that reflects a capacity of the Aitolian Koinon to implement, quote, border management policies, seems more dubious, at least beyond a very basic definition of what that phrase might mean. I would hasten to note, however, that one of the many aspects of this question I have not given due consideration so far is any evidence for the federal imposition of charges to individuals and goods for the privilege of transiting the general Amphiktyonic Aitolian region, that is Portaria et al. I would, however, like in this regard, again, thinking about the larger picture, I would like to introduce one final Amphiktyonic document that I think demonstrates the positivity of this relationship, or the productivity of the relationship. This one dates from about 178, that is approximately a decade after the Romans had expelled the Aitolian Koinon from Delphi and the Amphiktyonea. Now, at first glance, the composition of the council seems to be a throwback, in that document, seems to be a throwback to its earlier pre-Aitolian state. Here we have the document here, and we see that the Aitolians are gone, the Phocians are gone, while the Macedonian king, again, has 2 seats, the Thessalian delegation as well as back, and it reappears at its traditional lead position in the roll call of the ethne. And moreover, if you look at the total number of representatives here, 23 out of the traditional 24 spots are claimed. So it's a full meeting, the only absentee being a delegate from one of the Doric communities of the Eastern Peloponnese. So here we have again what the Amphiktyonea looks like after the Aetolians are kicked out. The decree does follow, however, the more recent Amphiktyonic practice of the later Aetolian period in identifying the representatives by their demotic, that is, the town from which they hail. And here we find a big surprise. The delegates of the Ainianes, here in this slide, here in this picture here, and in that delegation are identified as hailing from Kallipolis and from Calydon. And the delegates from the Locrians are listed as being from Fola and Trachonion. All of these sites, all of these towns are within the lands of the old Aetolian ethnos. And what is more, 2 of those delegates, Lukagos, the son of Hagetas of Kallipolis, and Nikandros, son of Bitos of Trachonion, are known to have held the highest office of the Aetolian Koinon, the strategia, in the years surrounding the date of this Amphiktyonic decree. Evidently, the Romans did not remove Delphi and the Amphiktyonea from Aetolian control at the behest of the Amphiktiones. More likely, they were rewarding Perseus's father, Philip V, for his support in the Roman fight against Antiochus and his Aetolian allies. So while Aetolian was thereafter nomina non grata at Amphiktyonic gatherings, at least according to their official delegations, some Amphiktyonic ethne, at least, were more than happy to maintain close connections with the Koinon, and the council at large was equally willing to seat individuals from Aetolia at their meetings, some of these individuals quite prominent in Aetolian political activity. This fact is yet one more indication that the Aetolian Amphiktyonic relationship of the Hellenistic era can be seen as an example of the successful overlay of federal identity and federal institutions atop older regional divisions and boundaries. And with that, I will conclude my presentation. Thank you for all your attending here, and I welcome any questions you may have of me.
Thank you very much for this very, very rich FeBinar. I'm really grateful. We are really grateful that you accepted our invitation. So the floor is open to questions and debate. Oh, there is a message in the chat by Maria Pretzler. She has to leave.
Yes, and Peter Funke also, Peter also indicated he had to leave too, unfortunately. Or perhaps fortunately for me, he won't be able to tell you I was wrong. I was all wrong.
No. Okay, both here in the room or online, you can write your question in the chat or simply raise your hand and ask your question live, which is even better. Here, there is a question by Elizabeth Meyer. I hope I pronounced your name correctly.
You did.
Please.
You did. Thank you.
Okay.
Hey, Joe.
Hey, Elizabeth.
Do you have any opinions about the specific nature of the relationship between the Aitolians and Delphi itself?
Could you clarify in what sense that they do they treat
I seem
Delphi?
to recall, who haven't looked at this for about a year, that towards the end of the 3rd century, there are some Aitolian officials active in Delphi itself, in the sanctuary itself, sometimes interpreted as imposing oversight, but also could be interpreted as assisting, or just a guiding hand or something.
Yes,
so
I do know what you're talking about. Yes, there is an official. There is an official who appears in the late 3rd century documents. There is a new official. I wish I should be able to remember the name of the official, but I can't. So that is the basis that this is an imposition. Another argument in favor of the Aitolians being these big bad guys who came in and took over is that the reason, or what we know about what happens after the Romans defeat the Aitolians and the Aitolians surrender to the Romans, as we have a number of documents from Delphi that honor the Roman general Manus Cecilius and others as well. And what's quite fascinating here is that you get a long list of individuals and properties that have been reclaimed for Delphi from these other individuals. And some of the individuals are, in fact, from areas we would consider part of the old Aetolian realm. Although what's interesting, a lot of the individuals who were kicked out are from the area of Amphissa and West Locris immediately as well, which is Amphiktyonic territory as well, too. So it is a bit of a mixed bag. I somewhat intentionally drew with very, very stark, broad lines here as well, too. But at least I think the situation is a bit complicated. I would also add, I think things change from the earlier portion when the Aetolians first show up in Delphi. As I said, I think that happens around 300, to the situation we've got when we get around 200, 100 years later. And you probably do see a development there. I would also add as well that in that same period, especially as we get later in the 3rd century, that we do have the phenomena, certainly in the Great War that breaks out between the Aetolians and Philip V in 220. It's sometimes called the Social War. Polybius's account of that makes it fairly clear that Philip and his allies frame this as a sacred war, that they are in fact going against the Aetolians because the Aetolians are in Delphi and they're doing bad things there. So in that context, and also in what follows, and it may well have been that Antigonus Doson in his fight with the Aetolians in the 220s, which is only kind of nebulously known, he may well have made that an Amphiktyonic issue, because the inscription from Xanthos does tell us that the reason that the Catenians lost their fortifications is because they had all rushed off to Delphi to defend Delphi. So it looks like there were Macedonian pretensions and Macedonian claims in the late 3rd century. It could well be in that context somehow or other that this Aitolian magistrate emerges there as well too. I'm not exactly sure, but you certainly are correct to raise that as a counterpoint to my happier view of how things are going, that all the Delphians are perfectly happy to have the Aetolians there.
I do think that for a long time it was a pretty symbiotic, not unhappy relationship. I just sort of curious as to the ending of it.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I see a question by Richard Bouchon, maybe. He wrote his question in the chat. Thank you very much for this very stimulating presentation. As for a possible memory of the Aitolian Amphiktyones symbiosis, I can't help but think of the letter from Hadrian to the Delphians in 125 AD, in which the emperor sets aside for the time being the question of the Aetolian votes in the Amphictyony. So this is a...
Thank you. Thank you for raising that. I had, in preparing for this talk, I had gone through some of the later manifestations, and the Amphictyonia does indeed continue to function all the way through, I think at least up towards the 2nd or 3rd century. It certainly is an important piece of Hadrian's Philhellenic policy and his whole, the whole Second Sophistic and all that comes out in the Roman period. I'll have to go back and look at that document again, though, because by that point, at least generally speaking, the general feeling is that the Aetolians are long gone as an identity by that point, and it may well be that we simply overlooked this. The general feeling is that the signs of the existence or the continuing functioning of the Aitolian Koinon seem to kind of disappear by the end of the 2nd century BCE. But I'll definitely go back and look at that. Thank you, Mr. Bouchon, for sharing that with us.
Thank you very much. So any other questions or comments also here in the room?
I would add also, if you think of something later, I think I left my email address on the slide, and I can certainly provide the slides to Elena and to Claudio if you would like to have them for future purposes too.
That would be great also for our students. Many thanks for this. Thank you. Well, I have a short question. If you can show us again the slides where you had a table with the delegates, the number of the delegates varying in the 3rd century BC, where there was a switch, not really a switch, but varying numbers for the Phocians and the Aetolians. It's very interesting, and the Boeotians. Okay,
let me see if I can, how far my technological skill, your screen sharing is paused.
It is right. You only need to look for the slides.
Yeah, let me just look for that quickly. Okay, is that showing up for you?
Table showing the number of delegates in the different years. Starting with...
What is that?
2080 and then...
Oh, I see what's going on. Sorry, I was going in the wrong direction. There we go.
2 and so on.
Yep. There we go. So
this one, thank you. Can you elaborate on the varying number of the Phocians and Aetolians precisely between 263 and 260? This is very interesting. You already explained this, I know, but if you can elaborate on this and explain it again.
Sure. Let me I will explain. Let me explain this by first noting to everybody here that we have the demotics of the Locrians being provided here. They are, here is Alponeos, this individual, the Locrian is from Alponeos. This individual simply calls himself Epicnemidian. He's from that region, so presumably not Opuntian, not from Opus. That's the point they're making. Here we have a Scarphaean again. And let me see if I can find the right map here to show that whole region again, because that's what I think is going on here with, okay, here we go. oops, sorry. So we have one individual from Alponeas here. We have another who is Epicnemidian, and then we have a Scarphaean here. I think what's going on here is that there's a dispute between Boeotia. They're putting pressure on the borders here, and they may, in fact, even in this area of Daphnos, we know, for example, in earlier times, and if Jeremy was here, Jeremy McInerney, he'd be able to talk about this. This area was a contested space between the Locrians and the Phocians at some point in the Archaic or Classical era. Here, I think we have a long-running dispute between the Boeotians and the Locrians over the control of this area of Opuntus here back in the 270s, and that's where the Locrian vote first disappears, and the Boeotians claim it, and apparently the rest of the Amphiktyonians are happy. Okay, that's fine. Let's solve this problem. You're Boeotian now. You know, you're not Locrian. The vote goes to the Boeotians, not the Locrians. But then the Locrians come back, and it's notable they call themselves Epicnemidian here. That is to say, we're not Locrians. This is the vote of the Epicnemidians, or even from Scarphaea, or even from the first place, Alpanos here. I think they're coming back, and then the Phocians are claiming that vote. Again, they're coming back and they are trying to claim the vote. So I think what we have here is indications that within the Amphiktyonic lands, that the old rivalries and the old contests for territory are being reflected in the number of votes that are showing up at the Amphiktyonic Council. And furthermore, then my general argument here, and let me go back to where was that? My general argument here is that that the Aitolians then come in. They've already by this point broken through that barrier, as we've seen, and they've brought the areas of Malus within the Aitolian Koinon. They've said, would you like to be Aitolian as well? And I suspect that what eventually happened here is that they simply said to the Locrians, look, you know, would you like to be Locrian? Would you like to, Locris, would you like to actually also be within the larger framework of the Aitolian Koinon? And the Locrians, sure, let's do that as a way to avoid being absorbed by the hated Phocians and the hated Boeotians, who they've been, you know, fighting against since time immemorial. So that would at least be my overarching explanation of this. Does that make any sense to you at all?
It does. It does. Many thanks. Yeah, really. I find it really convincing, both with regard to the contested areas, even micro areas, and both within the larger picture. Yes, I find it very, very convincing. Thank you very much.
Other questions?
Any other questions or remarks? So in that case, let me repeat that I am really grateful to Joseph Scholten for this wonderful FeBinar. We are really happy that we have the registration, the recording too, and that we will have your slides. Many thanks. And let me announce our next FeBinar, which will take place on March the 10th and will be delivered by Jeremy McInerney again, but the topic is not very specific. It is more generally about borders. The title is the first part of the title is Song Lines to Map Lines, Why Borders Matter. So stay tuned. Thank you very much.
And let me just complete also here, since I'm still sharing my screen, stop the screen screen. I want to share one more screen just to reinforce how we're all connected here. Thank you again for inviting me to this as well. A picture from earlier years in our lives here. Me here, and here is a rather younger version of Mr. McInerney as well, as we got our degrees at Berkeley many, many years ago together. So I look forward to seeing Jeremy at that point as well. And thank you again, also, all of you, for the wonderful invitation here. This has really gotten me started again, and I look forward to further interactions with all of you and to the further presentations in the FeBo series.
And thank you also for showing us this wonderful pic. Great.
All right.
Okay.
Okay.
Bye.
Take care, everybody.
Bye.
Ciao, ciao.
You,
Buonasera,
ciao.
buonanotte, buonanotte.
Oh, grazie.
Okay.